Today we're going to take a closer look at one of the most important, yet often misunderstood elements of long jump technique, the penultimate step, or in other words, the second to last step before the takeoff board. In many coaching discussions, the focus tends to be placed almost entirely on the takeoff itself. Athletes are often told to push harder off the board, extend more aggressively, or try to generate more lift at the moment of takeoff. However, when we look at the biomechanics of elite long jumpers, it becomes very clear that the quality of the jump is largely determined before the takeoff foot even reaches the board. In reality, the jump does not begin at the board. It begins during the penultimate step, which acts as the critical mechanical transition between the sprinting phase of the approach and the jumping action at takeoff. This concept was explained to me years ago by Randy Huntington, coach of Mike Powell, who still holds the world record in the long jump today. His explanation completely changed the way I understood the mechanics of the event. The penultimate step serves a very specific biomechanical function. During the run-up, the athlete is essentially sprinting, generating as much horizontal velocity as possible. But in order to perform the jump, part of that horizontal velocity must be redirected vertically at takeoff. This conversion from horizontal to vertical velocity does not happen suddenly at the board. Instead, it begins during the penultimate step. When we observe elite long jumpers, two consistent mechanical patterns appear during this step. First, there is typically a small reduction in horizontal velocity, and second, there is a controlled lowering of the center of mass. This lowering is not something the athlete intentionally performs by bending or squatting. Instead, it occurs naturally as a result of the mechanics of the step itself. The slightly longer step length and the way the foot interacts with the ground allow the body's center of mass to drop slightly before the final step, preparing the body for the vertical impulse required during takeoff. Biomechanically, this lowering of the center of mass is critical because it allows the athlete to store and redirect force, ultimately contributing to the vertical velocity needed to leave the ground effectively. Biomechanical studies of elite long jumpers show a very consistent pattern in the final two steps of the approach. Across elite athletes, the penultimate step is typically longer than the athlete's normal running stride, while the final step into the board becomes shorter. The typical elite pattern looks roughly like this. Penultimate step, about 8 to 10% longer than normal stride length. Final step, about 5 to 10% shorter than normal stride length. Data from championship competition supports this pattern. For example, biomechanical analysis from the 2017 World Championships long jump final showed that athletes increased their step length by approximately 6%, from the third to last step to the penultimate step, and then reduced step length by roughly 9% for the final step into the board. This sequence is not accidental. The longer penultimate step helps lower the center of mass, while the shorter final step allows the athlete to reposition the body more quickly under the center of mass before takeoff. This creates the optimal mechanical position to generate vertical force without excessively breaking horizontal velocity. One of the most important functions of the penultimate step is lowering the center of mass before takeoff. When the center of mass lowers during the penultimate step, the athlete creates the mechanical conditions needed to project the body upward during the final step. In biomechanical terms, this lowering allows the athlete to increase the vertical velocity component at takeoff. The IAAF biomechanical report shows that athletes who produced larger center of mass lowering during the transition into takeoff were often able to generate higher vertical velocities at the board, contributing to better jump performance. In practical terms, the penultimate step functions almost like a preloading phase before the takeoff impulse. Another important characteristic of the penultimate step is how the foot contacts the ground. Compared to normal sprinting, the penultimate step often shows a slightly fuller foot contact, rather than a purely forefoot strike. This fuller contact helps the athlete control the lowering of the center of mass while maintaining forward velocity. At the same time, the swing leg moves forward with what is known as a low heel recovery, passing roughly around the mid-calf level of the stance leg. This swing pattern helps maintain rhythm and prepares the body for the rapid repositioning required during the final step. Another subtle but important difference between sprinting and the penultimate step is the change in muscular contribution. While sprinting mechanics rely heavily on elastic hip extension and hamstring contribution, the transition into the jump requires greater involvement of the quadriceps. The penultimate step helps pre-activate the quadriceps so that the athlete is ready to produce the powerful knee extension needed during takeoff. This preparation allows for a smoother and faster transition between the approach and the takeoff step. One of the most common technical errors in the long jump occurs when the penultimate step looks identical to a normal sprint step. When athletes fail to modify their mechanics during this step, they miss the opportunity to properly prepare for takeoff. Another common mistake is reaching too far toward the board with the final step. When this happens, the penultimate step becomes excessively long and the athlete begins pushing too far horizontally. Instead of redirecting velocity upward, the center of mass is projected forward, producing a flat takeoff and reduced jump height. In some cases, excessive swing leg motion or high heel recovery can also generate excessive rotational inertia, disrupting the transition into the takeoff step. The takeoff itself is also often misunderstood. Many athletes are told to push off the board, which can lead to excessive braking and loss of speed. A more useful cue is to think about planting the foot and pushing fast into the ground, rather than trying to push off the board. The goal is to apply force rapidly while preserving as much horizontal velocity as possible. When the penultimate step has correctly prepared the body, the takeoff step becomes a natural continuation of the movement, rather than something forced or exaggerated. Ultimately, the penultimate step defines the quality of the takeoff. When executed correctly, it allows the athlete to maintain approach speed while creating the mechanical conditions necessary for vertical projection. The board itself does not initiate the jump. It simply marks the point where the final projection occurs. The true beginning of the jump happens one step earlier. From a coaching perspective, understanding the concept is only the first step. The next challenge is finding practical ways to help the athlete actually feel and reproduce the correct pattern. One of the main methods used is ground marking. By placing marks on the runway, the athlete can begin to organize the rhythm and spatial relationship of the final steps more clearly. This is useful because the penultimate step is not only a biomechanical concept, but also a timing and perception task. The athlete must learn where that longer penultimate step occurs, how it flows into the shorter final step, and how the body should feel when the pattern is executed correctly. The purpose of the markings is not to make the athlete dependent on visual references, but to help build awareness. Once the correct rhythm and sensation are found, the athlete can gradually internalize that pattern and reproduce it more naturally without external guidance. Another very effective teaching method is the use of very low boxes or small raised surfaces. In this setup, the third last step and the takeoff step are placed slightly above ground level, while the penultimate step occurs on the ground between them. This creates a simple but powerful external constraint. Because the penultimate step is relatively lower than the surrounding contacts, the athlete is able to feel the lowering of the center of mass much more clearly. This can be extremely useful for athletes who struggle to understand the concept through verbal instruction alone. Rather than asking them to artificially drop or force the movement, the setup allows the body to experience the correct rhythm and vertical preparation in a more natural way. Ultimately, all of these methods serve the same purpose. They help the athlete understand that the jump is organized before the board, not at the board. When the penultimate step is timed and executed correctly, the athlete is in a far better position to preserve approach velocity, lower the center of mass appropriately, and create the conditions for an effective takeoff. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content on sprint mechanics, jumping technique, and biomechanics, feel free to subscribe to the channel.